All right, so the title of this panel is called Covert Action, Persistent U.S. Attacks Against Democracy and Freedom, Past and Present. The description reads as follows. In the decades-long tradition of award-winning investigative journalism by writers for CovertAction Quarterly, this panel will address the secretive and nefarious activities of the U.S. government in their efforts to destabilize democratic processes, both past and present.
When we started something called Covert Action Information Bulletin, it was a struggle. When we first sat, and we at that time was Ellen Ray, Bill Schaap, Michael Ratner, Bill Kunstler, myself. I'm very sad to have to say the facts that I'm the last living one of those founders. But there are very real reasons to start this magazine, restart the magazine, relaunch it today. I'm going to discuss some of them. First of all, let's be very clear that the CIA does not act alone. It's not what they call a rogue agency. It is a very much central, not just in its name, but a central part of the national intelligence apparatus. There are no less than 17 other intelligence agencies. And I could list them, but why waste our time on that? One of them, of course, was outed no less by a general by accident. He slipped in and said during some testimony before Congress something about, oh, the NRO, and, you know, we're doing, the senator said, what? What's NRO? That's all right. What's NRO? National Reconnaissance Office, which manages all the satellites together with the National Security Agency. NSA used to be, their code word was never say anything, or no such agency. It's not a joking matter. It's very serious and very deadly. The CIA, for many years, was made out as an analysis agency that analyzes foreign policy. Well, the real truth is the dirty and the real important part of the CIA is the Deputy Directorate of Operations, DDO as it's called. It's now called the National Clandestine Service. They've fancied up the name a little bit. And we know in the last month, we now have a new Director of Central Intelligence, a woman by the name of Gina Haspel. Now, she went up on Congress and testified that I stand on the greatness of many women before me. I mean, she was making herself out as a feminist. And all these women in the CIA, they are my heroes, and a number of them paid with their lives. Their stars are on the wall at the CIA, where almost all of the stars on that wall are anonymous, no names listed. I had not ever heard before that there were women whose stars are on that wall. It may be true. I don't say it's not true, but there is some question. So this woman had a name inside the CIA, which John Kiriakou, if you look at our website, said we called her Bloody Gina inside the CIA. That was not a nickname. That was based on the fact that she enjoyed torture. She was directly involved in a so-called black site, a very racist term, no question, in Thailand, where one of their inhabitants, or I should say prisoners, was waterboarded 83 times. Just think about that. Where you believe you're drowning, where they put a towel over your face, they hold you down, all four limbs, and you're being drowned for 83 times. But there were all kinds of torture that she was involved with as well. The whole range of tortures which we know about. Sleep deprivation, held in very stress positions with your arms and legs stretched behind you, the parrot's beak where they hold you like this, hanging from a pole, strapped your body to a chain and whip you back and forth against stone walls, you name it. Also, they used dogs and insects. They had two psychologists come on board and to ascertain each of the phobias of these all men and what kind of insect, what do you think of insects? And so they introduced scorpions and they introduced other insects into these boxes that they had. I shouldn't say in the past tense, it's still going on today as we speak today. Now, CIA has engaged in torture over decades, and they do it. We're not the only ones. We train other agencies around the world. It was GINA in Chile. It was KCIA in Korea. The whole range of agencies which the CIA created. That's what we do. That's what the CIA does, is set up agencies, proxy agencies that carry out the CIA's bidding in all these countries. The purpose of which is to keep hold over the resources of that country, whether it's oil, whether it's minerals, whether it's water. We're now seeing the privatization of water in a number of countries under direction of the U.S. So intelligence is much more than gathering information. It is destroying governments, overthrowing governments, throwing elections, buying use of media, and I hope Bill will follow up with more on this because he has chronicled these activities in country after country after country. All you need to do is look at his website and find that list of dozens and dozens of countries who have faced the wrath of the CIA. You know, I had a dear friend of mine who, when I was in Laos, by the way, I should tell you, used to be known as the land of 1 million elephants. And it happens today I'm wearing a silk shirt made in Laos because I go back to Laos because of the fact that people are still dying from unexploded ordnance. They're called UXOs, bombs that still go off and maim and kill people. Today, long after the war officially ended. So in Laos, I was there helping to build a water shield of latrines and wells and one school. And suddenly I got word that this village where I had been working with this young Lao comrade and friend of mine had been bombed. I urgently went there, drove a jeep over the rice paddies. There are no roads in Laos at that time. Now there are some roads. So you had to drive over the rice paddy. I finally got to the village, and he had told me 2 weeks before that, if they ever bomb our village, that's where we'll go. That was the jungle outside of the village. The population of that village, perhaps 200 people. There were bodies scattered everywhere. There was no single structure left standing. So I went straight to the jungle where he had pointed to me, and I found him there. He was one of about 7 people still surviving at that point. And I took him in my arms, and he was bleeding to death through his ears. It was horrible. And I still recall saying, I will try and find out who bombed your village. Of course, at that time, in 1966, I didn't really know there was such an agency as the CIA. But I later, well, right then I started learning, seeing all these guys in plaid in their CIA uniforms, which are khaki pants and plaid shirts, you know, like folks are wearing today. And you knew them right away. I mean, it was like they had a sign on their, over CIA. So then, moving on to the fact that when I ended up in the Philippines, and Sarah I share a whole lot of comradely friendship with this great woman to my left. because of what she's doing and now facing a fascist, an outright fascist man, Rodrigo Duterte. But she can speak more on that. And so I ended up outside Clark Air Force Base, which we started a newspaper called The Whig, named after the Whig Party, which was the left-wing alternative to what became the Republican Party. It wasn't a socialist or a revolutionary party, but it was, in those times, in that context, quite a different party than we know of as today as the Republicans. And we wrote this paper called The Whig, and we outed, among other things, a death squad on Clark Air Force Base, run by the Air Force Police, OSI, Office of Special Intelligence. And they used to take Filipino workers at the base who were very militant. They had a union. They were defending their rights as members of the human race. It wasn't only about salaries, but it was about their rights working under very rough conditions for the U.S. for the Air Force. Very few people who worked for the Air Force in those days were able to own a house or have a living wage. So they used to take the workers up on these watchtowers and push them out to their death. And so we found out what this group was called. They were members of the some of them were Klan members and neo-Nazis, and they called themselves the Red Patches. In fact, they used to wear a patch on their shirts, and it had, if you look on your dollar bill, you have the famous all-seeing eye, which is a very cult symbol. So I knew who the seamstress was making these patches, so I went to her office and said, I came in and she said, did you order the patches? I said, yes. So I was reading her list upside down, and I recall that one of the names. I said, that's me, John, I don't remember his name. And she said, oh, here are your patches. So we went and published that on the front page of The Whig. The Associated Press journalist who I knew then picked it up and it went all over the world. Death Squad on Clark Air Force Base. Well, some of the people who wrote for us, GIs, many of them worked at the hospital there at Clark Air Force Base. And I'll tell you more about that place because I was a patient there later. And so they decided that this should be investigated, and so my photo was put up on the wall at the OSI entrance to the base, and was persona non grata, blah blah blah. So, but the fact is that I was lucky to get out of there alive, and they did take me in a Jeep and on a one-way trip to, I thought it was death at the end of that trip, but they took me to Camp Crame in Manila, and the rest is history. I just want to say, when people talk about the CIA, they have to understand that this is an agency which exists to support not only imperialism, but to support, overthrowing governments, as I've been saying. And that's what they do. The rest of what we're told they do is window dressing. Last I want to say is that the work that we're starting now is to counter what we know of as American exceptionalism. Every president in our lifetimes, if you think back, and all of you here in the room, has said those magic words: this is the greatest nation on the face of the earth. Hello? There are 196 other countries, maybe more by now, the latest count. So I guess they're sliced cheese. And Obama said this again and again. He said, we are exceptional. So I'm sorry, exceptionalism has no place, and that's what we have started this, relaunched this magazine to fight American exceptionalism and imperialism. Thank you.
I should say that I'm one of the contributors to Covert Action. Think about it, it goes back 20 years ago. And now I'm thinking about how old I am in some respect, because I feel like I was old then too. In any case, so it was 20 years ago, I wrote a piece with Jim Cement on the infiltration of unions by the fronts and so forth, the organizations of the Central Intelligence Agency. And so in that piece, which I'll get to when I close to some degree, we engage in a discussion and an analysis of the hypocrisy of both the Democratic Party and the complicity of the various branches of government and so forth, elected branches of government, with the so-called Project for Democracy, something that I think we all support, democracy. And so I will get into that discussion in a few moments. So, you know, when thinking of the CIA and Covert Action magazine, for many of you who already know it, and also others that are new to this concept, you know, what did they do? So what's so bad about supporting American interests on an international level? I mean, aren't we all in support of ideas of democracy, ideas of, you know, defending human rights, for instance? Isn't that something that the United States, if we go to the State Department page and its various agencies of the State Department, such as the CIA and so forth, they're interested in questions such as humanitarianism, and they're interested in concepts such as human rights and defending these various ideas. And in fact, when they discuss what they mean by human rights, I think we would also agree with some of those ideas. Defending young children and so forth. I don't know precisely from what, but they have their various examples of that. Defending women's rights on an international scale, that's a good idea, I think. Defending ethnic minorities, defending religious minorities, defending free speech, and on and on and on. I don't think any of us, you know, many people, who are we going to convince if we say, well, we oppose those things? So we're against free speech. We're against the idea of giving women equal rights on an international level. And so I'm going to go through, I think many of you already know some of these ideas and so forth, but I'll be very specific to the remit of my work, which is related to workers' organizations and trade unions and how they operate, both from my research and also in the field in various countries that I've been to, not as part of any government agency. In any case, so in my view, why should we be opposed to democracy? Why should we oppose, as the CIA frames it? Why should we be opposed to the rule of law, as the CIA and State Department frames it? And what is it that's pernicious that the State Department does, as well as the CIA does? Well, in my view, I think at the very bottom of this, or at the very core, is the question of imperialism. So without imperialism, you don't really have a CIA. You don't have these State Department organizations that are infiltrating various institutions on so many different levels. So that, in this case, there are tremendous debates about imperialism and so forth, but we should be very clear that imperialism today, for the 21st century, as it was actually since the Second World War, was to defend the economic privilege of, and this may be a bit controversial, all Americans, because we are relatively economically, or in some significant way, the ruling class of this country, very economically privileged vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And so whatever U.S. foreign policy does is to advance the interests of the ruling class of the major imperial power of the world, which is the USA. So with respect to trade unions and so forth, I was very much interested in the ways in which the various institutions, or democratically supported institutions, that were coming into being in the early 1980s under Ronald Reagan, under something called the National Endowment for Democracy. Another very interesting title, National Endowment for Democracy, supporting the ideas of free trade unions. So who's against free trade unions here? I'm not in any extensive way at all. So by free trade unions, we're talking about the idea of trade unions being able to operate independently on the basis of the American model. So anyone who really wants to build a very robust trade union should follow the U.S. model, not any other model around the world. That means the kinds of weak unions that we've become very familiar with since the end of the Second World War, after the Taft-Hartley Act that was put forward by Republicans and Democrats together, after the purging of the left, especially Socialist and Communist Party left in the 1950s under McCarthyism and so forth. The various institutions of power went rogue on a global level. And so the National Endowment for Democracy in 1981 under Reagan, which emerged under, I think, the same person's in charge of it as was before, and the Republican Institute, is funded directly by the US government and is directly involved in trying to democratize unions. So they go throughout the world, I can give a number of examples, and say, well, you know, this union, so let's say it's a South African union, this union isn't entirely democratic because they're not engaged in the same kinds of activities that we have here that have actually hurt and diminished the power of trade unions. So the idea of free trade unions, as Americans would put it, it's kind of a rhetoric, is to create weak working class movements on a global level. And to do so is to institute, through the ILO, in fact, even UN agencies, this model of freedom on a global level. So, you know, I'm not going to get into the various different sectarian differences on whether China is right, whether the Russian Federation is right in the aftermath of the end of the Soviet Union and so forth. But I think it's very important to recognize the ways in which these organizations operate, and in fact, by virtue of supporting, let's say, religious or ethnic groups, they're in fact diminishing the ideas of working class solidarity. So one example that I've become familiar with, and I know pretty well, is the case of the former Yugoslavia and the Balkans. The reason that I do is I've been to the Balkans and so forth and spoken to a number of labor union leaders, and also had been asked to work on various projects for both Western-style academic pro-labor sources, you know, the people who we know, and the most left people that we know in some respects, who say, yeah, why don't you work with us? We can talk about democratization in a place like the former Yugoslavia, let's say Serbia or Croatia and so forth and so on. But it so happens that there seems to be a specific way in which the various left, including the academic left, and that's something that I think hopefully we'll get into with respect to question and answer, the academic left has been in service of the State Department and the CIA in many respects, whether it's official or unofficial, wherever people get money from, in some respects, they are interested in advancing this goal. So with respect to Yugoslavia, one thing would be they would refer to the Yugoslav unions as cronies, and they'd refer to the Croatian unions as democratic, when it seemed, you know, we're talking about academic papers where I didn't see much of a difference necessarily, and in fact I saw higher levels of democracy in the Serbian case. I won't get into the specifics of it. And so for instance, one of the examples, and this person has been in the news in a very significant way, is George Soros, again another person, you know, who's against open society again. They're named after, you know, various classical sources and so forth to advance the ideas of democracy, debate, and so forth in a Socratic way and so forth. But in fact, they do have a pernicious side to them, and they are to defend American empire and class privilege on a global level. And so, you know, they're interested in election monitoring. They're interested in ensuring, once again, that not only union elections are free, so to speak, in their way, but also political elections. And George Soros, and I'm going to say something very briefly about this subsequently. George Soros has been deeply involved in the project of the Central Intelligence Agency, or the Secret Services of the United States. And it's not just he as a person. I don't know this person. There's been a lot of rhetoric about who he was, his connections and so forth to various pernicious types of organizational initiatives, including the ISG, International Security Group, which plans interventions throughout Europe and so forth, and also Central and Southwest Asia. And so through the Soros Foundation's Open Society Institute, a number of color revolutions have been advanced. I heard the name, I heard a couple of names that I don't support, certain people, mentioned here, especially Osama bin Laden. I think most of us here would be, I'm completely opposed to that person's agenda and anyone who advances it. But that notwithstanding, I would also say, oh, my time is almost up, so let me just cut to the chase. I also am opposed to Soros's agenda. I have 5 minutes. So with respect to this, I'd say that if we look through the history of various revolutions that took place, most of those so-called color revolutions have led to tremendous amount of loss of life, the destruction of schools, the destruction of healthcare systems, and even subsequent to the loss of life, the destruction of quasi-socialist systems. Now, I know a lot of people have differences of opinion, but if you go back to speak to, for instance, a person I know from Bosnia-Herzegovina who was a refugee after the war in Bosnia and had to come to the United States as a consequence of it. And she said, you know, the real shock that I had was not actually the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where she lost her father to gunfire from actually NATO forces. But where she really found shocking, more so than that, of course, when you lose a father at a young age, at 12 or 13, it's a huge shock, or mother, whatever the case may be. But what she was really shocked at was going back to her country, the former Yugoslavia, especially Bosnia and Herzegovina, and saw the complete destruction of their entire healthcare safety system. No more, forget about going to universities, even grade schools on some level. Forget about education. Forget about housing and so forth, or even a decent job. So you have people walking around with law degrees, doctor degrees, etc., who are unemployed or marginally employed, working in various types of NATO-type agencies and so forth. Okay, I want to just close by, I think, a caution. I don't know how much more time I have, but I think I'm drawing to the end. And that would be one that I think we should all be mindful of, having said all this kind of conceptual material. I wanted to go into some further ideas and examples. But the one point I want to make is that we have to be very careful. At least I'm going to be careful. I don't know how other people feel. But with respect to Covert Action magazine, I'm on the board. I'm going to be very careful. We must, in every specific way, avoid any kind of alliance with the right wing. So, for instance, when we criticize various organizations and we see, okay, you know, they are criticizing it along with us, and we're working with it in league with them, we have to avoid that at all costs. And so this is something some people may know already. I've said it in the past in different contexts. And that is that on the left, we have a very serious issue with respect to the politics of the left, the Democratic Party, the socialist parties in this country. I'm not naming any names, but as a general rule, there is a tendency, although not all socialists, on the left and among socialists, to be anti-racist, which we all are, to be opposed to sexism, and to oppose to xenophobia, which we all should be. I'm not going to say we are, but we all should be in every kind of way. And if we're not, we should educate people about that. And on the left, they tend to be pro-imperialist. I mean, there's a long history of this. It goes back to the Democratic Party's interventions to a greater extent than has been the case with respect to even the Republican Party. But I'm not going to parse things here, but I think there's a degree to which that's correct. So Democrats tend to be interventionists to a greater degree. So that's problematic, and I think that we need to learn on the left that how do we, for instance, analyze the Syrian situation today, or the Libyan debacle that took place in 2011, or the history of what might be happening in Armenia today with the intervention that may be occurring or not. Then, on the other hand, we have to look at the degree to which the right wing tends to be nationalistic. I don't like IST words. People know that, so I may not use the word. I just use the term racist, so whatever. Nationalist, I'll use the F word, fascist, racist, anti-imperialist. We see that on the right wing. We see the Trump agenda and so forth very clearly. But on the other hand, some people appeal on the left even, but also from a right-wing perspective, Rand Paul and so forth, where you might agree with some of their perspectives with respect to foreign policy, because they tend to be non-interventionist. They tend to oppose interventions on a global level. And so I would say for covert action, we must, by every single capacity that we have as a collective group, and I hope every people here participate actively and become active participants, we must object to allying with the right. right wing on foreign policy when it comes to their initiative against intervention. We oppose intervention completely. We must, identify the CIA and the State Department and the various security agencies on a global level as their source. And I was just told to stop, so we should stop the CIA. And you should get a button here they're available for free.
I'm happy to be with this panel. Let me just begin with a statement that a Marxist scholar started with in his new book, which I think is relevant to what we're doing. He says, and this is John Beller, "It is not information that wants to be free. It is us." In a news item 3 days ago, May 30, 2018, the Washington-based multi-lender IMF World Bank released its report, Making Growth Work for the Poor, a poverty assessment for the Philippines. The World Bank cites the following data on poverty in the Philippines. First, the richest 1% of Filipinos own more than 50% of the country's wealth. High concentrations of wealth constrain equal opportunities and access to services. Second, in 2015, some 22 million Filipinos, or more than 1/5 of the population, still live below the national poverty line. 2 out of 5 poor Filipinos live in Mindanao, the report said. And third, and by way of a solution, the report cites Sue Lu, senior economist at the World Bank's Poverty and Equity Practice. Quote, "Making a difference in Mindanao makes a big difference to the Philippines. Increasing public investment in Mindanao to boost development there would expand opportunities for conflict-affected communities, broaden access to services, and create more and better jobs." At this point, it is crucial to add that the nature of public investments in the Philippines, as in all economies in the world trapped in the IMF World Bank's structural adjustment, is public-private partnerships. While Mindanao is projected to be the hotbed of terrorism and the object of the Philippine state's all-out war, it is also a place where foreign direct investments already thrive, and with the IMF World Bank prescription, there can only be more. One of the lasting legacies of the American business are agricultural plantations in Mindanao, particularly in Bukidnon, its northern part. When plantations in Hawaii and California became problematic in 1928, Del Monte benefited from the Regalian Doctrine. It grants that all entitled land automatically become part of government colonial property. The utilization of land became the colonial government's affair. This meant the conversion of Moro, non-Christian indigenous land, into plantations for palm oil, banana, pineapple, and other monocrops. In 1964, for example, another TNC, and that's Dole, was established in South Cotabato, and this is also in Mindanao, and initially occupied 5,569 hectares of indigenous land. The expansion of large-scale agricultural plantations in Mindanao, with an estimated 300 hectares of land, have been planted for export with monocrops such as banana, pineapple, coffee, sugarcane, rubber, and palm oil. Even areas where traditional food crops such as rice and corn are grown have been encroached upon. With the dependence of super profits on growing economies of scale, this mode of encroachment and dispossession can only continue under so-called public investments, which come in the form of private-public partnerships. In big foreign mining business, Mindanao accounts for 117 out of 381 financial or technical assistance agreements and exploration permits. Mindanao also hosts 28 out of 46 operating metallic mines. Mining investment of $7.5 billion in 2006 generated $19.1 billion in gross production value of metallic minerals by 2014. This is not yet the whole picture. Yet with this, we can all understand why the IMF World Bank is explicit about its project to, quote, focus poverty reduction efforts on Mindanao. The IMF World Bank specifically identifies typhoons and conflict as factors that keep Filipinos poor. These factors make it appear as though poverty is largely caused by natural disasters and the impact of warring groups. This diagnosis justifies the intervention of IMF World Bank and U.S. military troops in the economic, military, and political affairs of the country. Here, violations of the right to self-determination and national sovereignty are presented as poverty reduction program and national security. Under the current Duterte regime, Mindanao has been under martial law since May 23, 2017, after the so-called Marawi siege. In July 2017, independently run Lumad schools, these are the indigenous people of Mindanao, were declared by Duterte as training grounds for the new People's Army. He then threatened to bomb these schools. At present, many Lumad communities have been displaced on account of militarization. Lumad school children have sought refuge in different sanctuaries in Manila to escape repression. Economic policies, military conduct, and their impact on the people of Mindanao show how what being tied to the strategic interests of imperialism in the Asian region looks like. The formation of revolutionary national liberation organizations in the 60s is a result of class struggle and not determinism, or environmental causes in the case of natural disasters, or racialized portrayal of revolutionary Filipinos as nomadic bandits. In fact, prior to the formation of these revolutionary organizations, Filipinos have been engaged in armed rebellion that threatened imperialist interests. This necessitated a partnership of President Ramon Magsaysay and CIA's pioneering Psy Warrior Air Force, Brigadier General Edward Lansdale. This partnership is known for its success in contributing to the 1954 wipeout of the Hukbalahap, or the anti-Japanese army that would also wage war against the Philippine government. Lansdale made use of two well-known myths to launch CIA combat Psywars. The first is the Aswang armies that uses myth of hostile and unseen creatures controlling certain spaces. In his very own memoir, titled In the Midst of Wars, An American Mission to Southeast Asia, Lansdale recalls, quote, "A combat Psywar squad was brought in. It planted stories among town residents of an aswang living on the hill where the hooks were based. 2 nights later, after giving the stories time to make their way up to the hill camp, the Psywar squad set up an ambush along the trail used by the hooks. When a hook patrol came along the trail, the ambushers silently snatched the last man of the patrol, their move unseen in the dark night. They punctured his neck with 2 holes, vampire fashion, held the body up the heels, drained it of blood, and put the corpse back on the trail. When the hooks returned to look for the missing man and found their bloodless comrade, every member of the patrol believed that the aswang had got him and that one of them would be next if they remained on that hill. When daylight came, the whole hook squadron moved out of the vicinity," unquote. This Psywar op did not completely defeat the hooks. Another Psy-op called Eye of God was by far more effective. A series of political vilification would take place as when government troops would use information from counterintelligence efforts and call out the names of hook guerrillas over loudspeakers, urging surrender or promising a certain death. Lansdale's all-seeing eye technique targeted citizens who were suspected of helping the hooks. Lansdale wrote, quote, "The army would warn these people that they were under suspicion. In the middle of the night, a Psywar team would creep into the town and paint an eye on a wall facing the house of each suspect. The mysterious presence of these malevolent eyes the next morning had a sharply sobering effect. The Aswang Psywar tactic worked to take the Hook Squadron out of the mountains, while the Eye of the God prevented further recruitment from the masses. Multiple tactics and the infliction of continuous punishment on people who otherwise did not know what their crime was, because they did not do anything against the law to begin with, are decisive factors for the defeat of the Hook. The Magsaysay-Lansdale partnership, with the latter's grooming of Magsaysay to become the American boy, also included preventing Magsaysay's strong political rivals to run for elections through actual rigging of elections and an electoral campaign that depicted Magsaysay as being of humble origins, when in fact he came from a landed family, that he was a mechanic before he joined politics, and a famous jingle after an American pop song, Mambo Mambo Magsaysay, Mambo Mambo Mabuhay, or Long Live Magsaysay. Our democracy will die kung wala or without Magsaysay. Former CIA Joseph Smith claims that Lansdale's invention of Magsaysay was crucial in the U.S., quote, spread of democracy throughout the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO. According to Smith, quote, it was believed that the Filipinos would be more readily accepted than Americans in roles as political advisors and liaison officers with local intelligence services, unquote. The Freedom Company, established by Lansdale in 1954 with Magsaysay as honorary president, and by then he was already the president of the Republic of the Philippines, aimed to deploy Filipinos to Vietnam and elsewhere. Personnel of the Freedom Company assisted in drafting South Vietnam's constitution, trained the Vietnamese President's Guard Battalion, organized the Vietnamese Veterans Legion to tie in with one of the Cord Mayor's schemes to use veterans groups as an anti-communist front, and ran the huge Operation Brotherhood activity. Further, Smith claims, not without reason, that the USA's, quote, faithful entanglement in Vietnam began in Manila in the early 1950s and not in Saigon in the early 60s. Lansdale and Magsaysay were forced to implement reforms on the military and curb corruption in government as part of the counterinsurgency, for they had to match the moral credibility of their communist counterparts. However, the decisive defeat by the communists of the imperialist project in Vietnam, the continuing socialist construction in China, and the spread of national liberation struggles in Asia, Africa, and Latin America and the Caribbean during this period modified the role of the CIA in that it stopped being the main implementer of reforms in partnership with local ruling oligarchs. But CIA reforms can still be seen in current low-intensity conflicts launched by the local military against revolutionary groups. I will go back to this in a bit. In a study made by Ibon Philippines in cooperation with UNDP, there are two major revolutionary armed groups in the Philippines, namely the Communist Party of the Philippines, the New People's Army and its front, the National Democratic Front, and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Both groups assert continuity with long histories of armed struggle in the country that go back not just decades but centuries. The radical change they espouse through armed struggle reflects the historical conditions of colonization, poverty, inequality, and the marginalization whose effects are still being endured by significant sectors of the Philippine population: landless peasants, exploited workers, and marginalized Muslims. Essential to both groups is the approach of developing, cultivating, and nurturing their respective geographic areas and communities of influence. This has resulted in the revolutionary and armed groups' influence on these areas over the years, which has caused the Philippine state to respond with counterinsurgency operation. The MILF had been oriented to a combination of more conventional positional warfare, while the New People's Army, whose declared guerrilla front zones, uses guerrilla tactics. The NPA strategy of People's Protracted War is met by the AFP with low-intensity conflict used in localized forms across Asia and Latin America. LIC, which combines military means with political, economic, and psychological information propaganda warfare in an integrated counterinsurgency package. LIC acknowledges that the contending parties to the armed conflict effectively compete in the same territorial community space, unlike in conventional warfare where battle lines and fronts are more clearly drawn. It also acknowledges that the NPA relies on the voluntary participation of communities for logistical support and for new fighters. So to wrap up, what are commonly conceived as two separate spheres, economic and military, meld into one in the case of the Philippines, both in the realm of state control and armed revolution. Economic reforms dubbed by the IMF World Bank as poverty reduction schemes are actual local oligarchies partnerships with foreign investors that result in the exploitation and repression of Filipino labor, land grabbing, crisis in food production. The resistance by organized and politicized communities is met with military repression, which involve both covert and overt operations. The current martial law in Mindanao and Duterte's consolidation of repressive power, as seen in the ouster of the Supreme Court Justice, a branch of government that was relatively autonomous compared to the legislative, and his war on drugs, killing more than 16,000 poor people, his declaration of militant organizations as terrorist organizations, the pending implementation of a national ID system show the potentials and the limits of market freedom. It is freedom for foreign monopoly capitalists and repression for the rest of us. Thank you so much.
Okay, we can all agree, I think, that U.S. foreign policy must be changed, and that to achieve this, the mind, not to mention the heart and soul of the American public must be changed. But what do you think is the main barrier to changing the minds of Americans about U.S. foreign policy? Each of you, I'm sure, has met many people who support our foreign policy, with whom you've argued and argued. And you cite example after example, from Iraq to Libya to Vietnam. And you speak of the bombings and the invasions and the torture. And nothing helps. Nothing changes the minds of these people. Now, why is this? Are they simply lacking a social conscience? Or are they just stupid? What is it that holds them back from seeing what we see? I think the answer to that question is that consciously or unconsciously, these people proceed from certain basic assumptions, and then if you don't change those basic assumptions, it's like talking to a stone wall. The most basic of these basic beliefs is, I think, a deeply held conviction that no matter what the U.S. does abroad, no matter how bad it may look, no matter what horror may result, the U.S. government means well. American leaders may make mistakes, they may blunder, they may lie. On occasion, they will certainly do more harm than good, but they do mean well. Their intentions are always honorable, even noble. Of that, the greater majority of the American public is convinced. Frances Fitzgerald, in her famous book, a famous study of American school textbooks, summarized the message of these books. Quote, "The United States has been a kind of Salvation Army to the rest of the world. Throughout history, it has done little but dispense benefits to poor, ignorant, and diseased countries. The U.S. always acted in a disinterested fashion, always from the highest of motives. It gave, never took. And Americans genuinely wonder why the rest of the world can't see that. Why can't they see how self-sacrificing we have been? And they remind me, the American public reminds me of, what's his name? Charlie Brown falling for Lucy's football ploy again and again, and they never learn. Many of the citizens are like the children of a mafia boss who don't know what their father does for a living and don't really want to know. Then they have to wonder why someone just threw a smoke bomb through the living room windows. Their basic belief in Americans' good intentions is often linked to American exceptionalism. Let's look at just how exceptional America has been. I've spent decades and decades summarizing these things. Since the end of World War II, the United States has, one, attempted to overthrow more than 50 foreign governments, most of whom which had been democratically elected. Two, dropped bombs on the people of more than 30 countries. Three, attempted to assassinate more than 50 foreign leaders. Four, attempted to suppress a populist or nationalist movement in 20 countries. Five, grossly interfered in democratic elections in at least 30 countries. And six, led the world in torture. Not just the torture performed directly upon foreigners by Americans, but providing torture equipment, torture manuals, lists of people to be tortured, and in-person guidance by American teachers, especially in Latin America. This is indeed exceptional. No other country in all of history or anywhere in the world comes anywhere close to this record. But it certainly makes it difficult to believe that America means well. So the next time you're up against one of these Americans with whose mind is closed against this, whose mind is like a stone wall, ask the person what the U.S. would have to do in their foreign policy to make them change their mind. What for them would finally be too much? Most likely, or whatever it is this person might suggest, the U.S. has already done. Keep in mind that our precious homeland, above all, seeks to dominate the world. For economic reasons, nationalistic reasons, ideological, Christian, and for other reasons, world hegemony has long been America's bottom line. And let's not forget the powerful executive branch and the military, whose salaries and promotions and whose agencies' budgets and future well-paying private employment, all of which depends upon perpetual wars. One war after another assures them of this rosy future. These leaders are not especially concerned about the consequences of what they do. They're not necessarily bad people, but they are amoral, just like a sociopath is. Take the Middle East and South Asia. The people in those areas have suffered horribly because of Islamic fundamentalism. What they desperately need are secular governments which have respect for other religions. And such governments were actually instituted in the recent past. But what was the fate of these governments? Well, in the late 1970s through much of the 1980s, Afghanistan had a secular government that was relatively progressive, with full rights for women. That's hard to believe, isn't it? But even a Pentagon report of that period has certified that this was the case. They even praised them for what they were doing. And what happened to that government? Well, the U.S. overthrew it, of course, allowing the Taliban to come to power. So the next time you hear that we have to remain in Afghanistan for the sake of the women, keep in mind what I'm saying. After Afghanistan came Iraq, another secular society under Saddam Hussein. And the U.S. overthrew that government as well. And now the government has its share of crazed jihadists, and women have to be very careful of how they dress to avoid becoming victims of these jihadists. Next came Libya, again a secular society under Muammar Gaddafi, who, like Saddam Hussein, had a tyrant in him, but could, in important ways, do some marvelous things. Like he founded the African Union, and under him, Libya had the highest standard of living in all of Africa. So, of course, the U.S. overthrew him as well. In 2011, with the help of NATO, we bombed the people of Libya almost every day for more than 6 months, which is seldom mentioned these days in the news whenever you hear about the U.S. overthrowing North Korea using the Libyan model. We never reminded much at all about the U.S. bombing, which was horrific for 6 months. So what is the leader of North Korea to think about this when he reads and he mentions that you warned us about being part of the Libyan model? Can anyone say in any of these interventions or in any of them that the United States means well? When we attack Iran in the future, will we mean well? Will we have the welfare of the Iranian people at heart? I suggest you keep such thoughts in mind the next time you're having a discussion or argument with one of the flag-waving, stone-closed minds of Americans. Keep in mind what I've said to attempt at least to enlighten them. Thank you very much.